building at this point, grounded theory, just seeing what people are saying, no testing at this point. But it seemed to me that relationships actually mattered here because they were shaping the communication through which coordination occurs. And this was happening sometimes in this very positive cycle, relatively shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect, driving sufficiently frequent communication, timely, problem solving rather than blaming, which helped to reinforce that kind of shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect. So that was mutually reinforcing, but often we saw a very different cycle where people had functional goals that tended to be seen to the exclusion of the larger goal, so what Herb Simon would call sub-goal optimization, specialized knowledge to the exclusion of a systems perspective, and a lot of perceived lack of respect, driving this infrequent, delayed, finger-pointing communication, and so on. So I defined this as relational coordination and started to, of course, test it with this network measure that measures these ties across work groups and tied it to outcomes that airlines try really hard to achieve every day. And this is just a kind of regression table showing, once you control for these other factors that drive efficiency and quality outcomes, the scale of the operation, the complexity, and so on, relational coordination does make a significant difference for driving less gate time per flight, so high utilization of the capital resources, less staff time per passenger, and certainly the quality outcomes that we all experience as passengers. And this is kind of the scatter plot showing the findings. But just to move to my next industry, people really question. They said, well, maybe this is just a Southwest kind of thing. Is this really something that's more generalizable? So I explored it, motivated by my experience having my daughter in the hospital, by looking at patient care and thinking this is very similar. We have people who know their jobs incredibly well, but a lot of things fall through the cracks, and you get patient error, you get a lot of breakdowns. And so, again, we have a major coordination challenge, and different organizations handle it differently. And as people were saying at the time, people were starting to recognize healthcare is very much harmed, both in terms of quality and cost, by this lack of coordination. And this is the first physician that I interviewed, Dr. Clem Sledge, the chief of orthopedics at the Brigham in Boston. He said the communication line just wasn't there. We thought it was, but it wasn't. We talk to nurses every day, but we aren't really communicating. And when I talk to nursing audiences, they say, yeah, it's because they're not listening, they're just talking. So nurses really get this, but they were really seeing the same problem. This is a clinical nurse specialist at MGH. Miscommunication between the physician and nurse is common because so many things are happening so quickly. But because patients are now in and out so quickly, it's even more important that we communicate well. So I did a very similar study of surgical patients in 9 hospitals, New York, Boston, Dallas, and measured relational coordination the same way, kind of these networks of how frequently, how timely is your communication, how added accuracy of communication, problem solving versus blaming when things go wrong, and so on, and measured P outcomes, doing the risk adjustment that the industry experts advise me to do, just like with the airlines. And found that controlling for these other factors, relational coordination, again, matters for quality and efficiency outcomes that hospitals are trying very hard to achieve. And looking at a scatter plot, this is aggregating the patient to the hospital level. You can see these outcomes are connected to each other. So what I took away from this is that here is one of those dynamics. It shouldn't be so surprising, but like any fundamental process improvement, it doesn't just let you move up and down this kind of boundary, but actually helps you push out the production possibilities frontier so that you can, even if you're still doing trade-offs, you're doing both of them better than you could have otherwise. And so I tried to start to make sense of why does this matter? It seems to help both in terms of quality outcomes, efficiency outcomes, and increasingly, as my colleagues in the field are looking at, well, what does it do for the employee experience? Drives less burnout, less emotional exhaustion, better satisfaction with the job, more career satisfaction, and so on. And my kind of thinking about this is that these kind of relational dynamics enable people to connect with each other in a way that's satisfying for them, but also to connect better around the customer and to coordinate things on the fly as circumstances change, because we're not, no one really, it's rare to have a job where you don't have circumstances that are changing as you're carrying out the job. And so this matters for letting people to basically adjust to each other and to the situation in a dynamic way. And so this is one way to visualize this again, where people, regardless of their different areas of expertise, are able to align with each other and connect around what it is we're doing for this customer or this group of customers. So here's where we get to the changing nature of work. There are conditions that, that increase the performance impact of relational coordination, and there are some of the same things we see in information processing theory, where you need more higher bandwidth forms of coordination when these conditions arise. Higher task interdependence, meaning it's not just sequential, you do this and then I do this, but reciprocal, where the interdependence goes in both directions. The greater uncertainty, where you can't just decide ahead of time, this is what we're going to do because the circumstances change. And finally, time constraints, so that, you know, if you had all the time in the world, you really don't need to coordinate because eventually everything will get done. So those are really important, and I've come to see this last one is also important, and that is the increasing desire of customers to get involved in the process and not just be passive recipients of whatever is being delivered. And not just the desire, but the kind of the efficiency benefits and quality benefits of getting clients to engage as partners in the outcome. So this co-production, all of those increase the performance benefits of relational coordination. And they really, in a way, that's telling us what's the changing nature of work. It's that these are increasingly common conditions. So what does that mean for organizations? Well, what it turns out is that you can design an organization with formal structures that either solidify the silos that keep people working in their own areas of expertise, but kind of blind to what's going on around them, or you can design those structures to connect across, whether it's how we select, how we train, how we're attentive to conflict resolution across rather than just within, between supervisor and employee, how we measure performance, how we reward, how we design our IT to either intensify the kind of fragmented thinking, or actually allow people to connect how they're thinking with each other around the customer. But one thing that my consulting colleagues have pointed out, because for years, as I show, well, these structures predict these relational patterns which predict these outcomes, the feedback I get is that's great, but you can't necessarily go in there and change the structures and change the way people are working, because these are very deeply embedded patterns in not only the organizational culture, but as it turns out, in the human beings that work in those organizations. So if coordination really is relational, it's not that easy to change. These patterns are established during our formative years. They're ingrained in our professional identities, our personal identities, and I think a lot of the neuroscience is establishing that these connections and how we relate are established and even embedded in our brains. And so one of the questions is can we even change these patterns in an intentional way? And what are the schools that we grow up in doing to change the way, you know, the next generation, and how, and we have people here who are fostering a lot of innovation in education. That's one of the panels that we'll get to enjoy tomorrow. Alums from Reed who are saying, okay, we need to do education in a different way for many reasons, but one of which is we need a more collaborative way of people learning to work together at a very young age. And if I look at what my daughters are doing and what they did in elementary school and throughout school, it was much different than what I did at their age. So what this leads me to is, what are the implications for Reed? And how conducive is the Reed experience for fostering this capability to do relational coordination? And in many ways, it looks like a great place and a great environment to foster relational coordination. Think about the conference method of teaching. I mean, you're sitting around the table, you are engaging with each other and solving whatever and really analyzing and coming to some kind of conclusion together. Not sure that it always happens that way. I'm remembering some conference kind of conversations. Peter Steinberg, I thought, was excellent at this, where you really had this shared sense of purpose. But I know from my own experience as teaching, those methods can also generate a lot of posturing and so on. rather than real collaborative problem solving. Senior thesis can be somewhat isolating. I loved my senior thesis. I learned a lot from it that has informed my work, but there's a lot that we do at Reed that can be very individual focused. And so just thinking here about the balance. And interestingly, my daughter, who is coming to Reed next year, I see on her desk at home this brochure that she loves. It's called Inquire Within, I think is the tagline. I'm thinking that's really cool. And I came to Reed in part to inquire within. But a lot of my best learning was going beyond that. And not just going into my own head, but what was I hearing at the table? What was I hearing when I went out and did all these internships in the local Portland area about engaging with the world and what was going on out there? So I think it suggests the importance of a lot of the current efforts that we're seeing, both to build community at Reed, so it's a more collaborative, less isolating experience, because it could go either way for people, and also potentially to engage students, even while they're students, in connecting with the outside world and getting out of the library, you know, getting out there and working for local organizations to really see how those connections can better prepare them for launching into really exciting work after leaving here.
Okay, so I'd like to begin today by being honest with you. There are some fairly grim realities that come with the Reed degree. Outside of the Pacific Northwest, most people don't know what Reed is. There's no good old boys club like at Harvard or Yale, where alumni are posted in high positions throughout Fortune 500 companies, handing out six-figure entry-level salaries. Outside of the sciences, a liberal arts degree doesn't have a great deal of direct professional application. There's not a lot of philosophy and classics jobs out there. Your GPA is comparatively low, and your debt load is comparatively high. Honestly, this part of it kind of sucks. But Colin Diver and Steve Koblick before him have seriously upgraded the profile of the school, and Career Services has taken a huge step forward with the working weekend. I think we're doing a lot to facilitate the transition of students from college to career. But the fact remains that the Reed degree is not a high-end job ticket. On the other hand, that's not what we came to Reed for. The type of people who complete 4 years at this institution are not the ones who are looking for a brand name degree that magically unlocks doors. We came to Reed and stayed at Reed because we believe in the education here and not the degree. At the center of that education is the notion that reality is not a given. It's constructed. It's a process. The things that people agree to and accept in the world around us are things that we challenge and break apart. The axioms people live by in the world are, for us, merely opinions to be tested. Whether you're the student who wrote music in Prexy, studied ions in the reactor, tripped on mushrooms in the canyon, or talked politics in the SU, you came to Reed and stayed at Reed because it was the one place that gave you the space and freedom to shatter reality into its constituent parts, learn about those parts, and reformulate them in new and exciting ways. To put it another way, you didn't come here to learn something, you came to learn how to learn. I mean, sure, with the Reed education, you will kick ass at Jeopardy for the rest of your life, especially when the categories involve things like famous figures from the 3rd century BCE. But the fact is, few Reed graduates really continue in their field of study. There's a portion of the student body who will continue in academia for the rest of their lives, but most of them will pursue careers far from the humanities. Again, though, that's not the point of Reed. The point was not necessarily to learn all the juicy gossip Suetonius had about Nero. The point was to learn how to unpack problems, how to get to the root of issues, how to separate what's important from what's merely rhetorical noise. At Reed, we learned how to craft arguments, develop solutions, and create the foundations for new futures. So if you were the kid in high school who was a little bit different and didn't exactly approach the world in the way everyone else did, let me assure you that it will most likely be the same deal in your career. You will probably not have a clear, simple, linear path through life. But you will find that because of this education, you are an invaluable asset. The analytical rigor and multidimensional thinking that you've developed at Reed are the skills that executive directors, CEOs, and HR departments dream of. You have the potential to do so many great things during your career, but you'll have to do it independently of a name and a major on a piece of paper. You'll have to do it by pursuing your passion and using the tools that this institution gives. As for myself, the place where I am today is a long, long way from where I started. I grew up in a podunk little town in Texas. We didn't have anything but cow pastures and a super Walmart. And don't get me wrong, I love being from the South, but I dreamed endlessly of getting out. And when I was a kid, my biggest hero was Indiana Jones. I wanted to be out in the jungle with people sporting crazy tattoos, drinking fermented beverages, and looking for the fountain of youth. So by the time